Safeguards are the way to get the laws through. We'll safeguard it to the nth degree and you're all going to be fine. Pass the law. Safeguards are blocks to autonomy. And, you know, what is this really about? It's about autonomy. And that's part of the playbook.
Welcome to Assisted. I'm Chelsea Roff. Assisted dying is said to be a compassionate, caring choice.
But in this series, we explore why it's not that simple. I'm Fiona McKenzie, and we'll look at why assisted dying has such a big impact on women.
Welcome back, everyone. Fiona and I are so happy to be here with one of my favourite people in this work, Liz Carr, who probably is a woman who needs no introduction, but we'll just say she's an actress and an activist, and she has been raising awareness about assisted suicide and euthanasia and the impact of these laws on disabled people and really all people since, We'll ask you that in a moment, Liz. I know I was listening to your radio documentary from way back in 2013 this morning. So since longer than certainly Fiona and I have been in this work.
I mean, Chelsea and I probably didn't think about this much until about a year ago at most. So you've been campaigning on this for a fair time. But what actually drew you into campaigning on this? Because presumably it feels very live, like the law might change soon, but that hasn't always been the case.
It sort of has. Weirdly, it has. I know to a lot of people this feels new and closer than ever before, and in some degree becoming legal in Westminster. Maybe it is. But it's been around, Not Dead Yet, who I'm part of, who's a network of disabled activists, really, they began way before I was involved. They began in the news in the States, and Diane Coleman. And then Jane Campbell, now Baroness Campbell, a disabled activist campaigner who's in the Lords, she took that mantle on, because she could see we could see that whilst the label is that this is for terminally ill people, firstly, a few things about that. There is such a fine line between disability and terminal illness that it's invisible. Pretty much all terminally ill people are disabled. Not all disabled people are terminally ill, but the other way around. And when it came to the campaigns, particularly the very high-profile campaigns, it was almost always a disabled person who wanted the right to die. And the press and the media and the law and medicine were all hugely supportive of that. So it became really clear as soon as in the news, when I got very, very involved in disability politics, disability rights, campaigning, I could see the connection here. The disability and our lives are seen as so low in value and less worth than the majority of people that death is seen as preferable to being disabled. And we come full circle. I know we're going to talk about it, but my documentary that came out on BBC last year was called Better Off Dead? ? And that's because complete strangers will say to particularly visibly disabled people, gosh, and they mean it that's the hilarious thing anyway. They mean it as a compliment. They mean it as a kind of, wow, you, because you cope with it. But it's kind of like, if I was like you, if I was that disabled, if I was in a wheelchair, I couldn't cope. I would rather be dead. And I guess what that has taught me, when you're on the sharp end of that, and you feel it in practice when you're involved in the medical profession, you feel it when you're involved in the benefit system, you feel it when complete strangers think that of you. I think as long as that inequality exists, there is no safeguard that they can bring in that will make all of us safe. And by that, I mean terminally ill people, marginalised people, disabled people. We're talking about women as well. Certain groups absolutely cannot be safeguarded from the abuse and the mistakes that will come. They will come.
And you raised such a powerful point there, which is that even if you are terminally ill, that causes a disability, and it's quite possible that your doctor or friends or family might think, well, aren't you better off dead? And that's kind of horrifying. That's the kind of thing that, disability activists have been pushing back against.
Yeah, nobody wants to be disabled. It's seen as the worst thing ever. Like I say, it's a worse fate than death. And I also understand that. I understand why when people, which is the majority, majority of people that want assisted suicide and who front it and have in recent years, that the past couple of decades, they are non-disabled people who've become disabled, and they are shocked. Of course they are. And they are in grief and shock and trauma, and all of those things I absolutely understand. And that's why I feel very passionately that you do not greet that grief and terror and fear with the offer of assisted suicide, rather than the supports of, this is tough, this is awful, it must feel that way, the changes in your life, but let's see what we can do to make it better before we start, helping you on your way. Yeah, I think whenever I read anything on this subject, still, like I was on Twitter before reading what's happening at, in the committee today, and it kind of breaks my heart, really, because it's so clear to me how damaging it is and how simple the solutions are, that, yeah, I kind of go, why can't? But it's a bit like going, why can't everybody be nice and happy? It's a bit like that. It's like, why can't we work this out? Because I think there are ways to make. I don't think it's necessary.
I mean, I wanted to talk a bit about the history of the movement, but I think, again, you've got an incredible point there, which was that the focus on terminally ill patients is something that's actually quite new to the assisted dying movement. And I know from my work that a lot of the campaigning in the 80s was around people who were just disabled after an accident, for instance, people who were just elderly and maybe had the beginning of disability or dementia. And actually there was a completely prevailing viewpoint in organisations, Dignity in Dying, as was then known, the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, that it wasn't necessary to have a terminal illness to be able to access euthanasia. So it's comparatively very recent that the focus has been, at least in the big campaigning organisation like Dignity in Dying, on terminal illness only. And there are lots of other campaigners, aren't there, who are, who think more widely, who think that euthanasia should be offered for people with Parkinson's. I think that's one of the amendments that's been put forward, that people who just want to die because they have a completed life, even that there are campaigners who think that, who are active in the UK.
It's just I always think there's a playbook. There is a playbook. There's the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. These groups gather every year or every couple of years, and they discuss how to get these laws over the line. There is a playbook. They know what they're doing and they know how to do it. You're deluded. Individuals are deluded if they think it's anything other than that. So there is a kind of, a way to do this. And the strongest way to get a law in is to make it for terminally ill people, because you're some kind of evil, uncompassionate, bad person if you say no to a terminally ill person having what they want. Basically, whatever they want at the end of their life, they should be given. And if you say no to that, then you're bad. So it becomes really, really difficult to fight these things when it's that. It used to be, you're absolutely right as well, and I think personally, I remember, still is to a degree, it was for disabled people. It was for, sure, suicide is legal, but what about those that can't kill themselves? What about those that can't physically do it? And so it became about disabled people. But of course, I am not somebody that believes in rational suicide. I am someone that believes that we need to give people the right support when they're suicidal. I do believe it's also your choice and your body in that sense. But it stops being your choice, and it stops being a personal and a private matter when it involves significantly changing the law and removing the current legal protection that exists, and instead puts it in the hands of doctors. And I'm sorry, but behind closed doors in a doctor's surgery is somewhere what can you prove? Medical negligence is one of the hardest things to prove, and the baseline is pretty much good faith. As long as the doctors are not doing anything malicious and they're acting in good faith, then they get off. This is a law. It doesn't empower individuals. It indemnifies doctors, and that's terrifying.
True.
Yeah, and I think that nuance that you just spoke to, Liz, is often lost, and we've seen it in the US, where really it's not a law that's giving people more choice as much as it is to giving legal protections to physicians who prescribe or administer lethal medications, but that nuance is often lost. You mentioned Diane Coleman's work, who was one of the first people to really kind of figuratively take my hand in this work, and I was brand new to it. And I think sadly many people don't really wake up to what's happening until it affects someone close to them. And what you were saying, and I think that's maybe a really tragic part of human nature. But I know when I started, one of the things I found, and I think Fiona's found this similarly with women's organizations, is everyone just was a bit sleepy about it. I felt like, I woke up to it, and then I wanted everybody else to come on board, all the eating disorder organizations to sign statements. And I remember Diane saying education takes time, which is something I've kind of held to. I wonder what, this was not a question I planned to ask, but how do you understand that inertia that we've seen in some of the really larger organizations that are, we generally think of as progressive and acting to ensure that people who are in vulnerable situations, I won't call them vulnerable people, but are adequately protected by our laws or policies. What do you make of that inertia? Do you think it's rooted in, stigma? Do you think it's rooted in a lack of education? I don't know.
I think there's a few things. I think that, it's so important to me, this campaign, but to most people, it's not. There are a few of us at either end of the spectrum who are losing sleep about this. And the majority of people might open the paper and go, in the same way they do about Ukraine or whatever, these major, major issues in some ways, it's just another social issue. And we're all a bit overwhelmed with that. And unless it touches us, then we don't have the capacity. And I think that's an increasing experience, is we just don't have the headspace, will be a phrase used, or the capacity to deal with other things. So, and maybe in the name of, again, another phrase that's very more contemporary, is kind of in the name of self-care, we only take on what we can take on. And I think that's, I'm aware of that. But I think the inertia is because the progressive default as to support assisted suicide. How can it be a bad thing to offer choice? How can it be a bad thing giving dying people or poorly people, people with these awful lives, giving them what they need? And what they need and what they're asking for is to end it. And, it's seen as so progressive. And I actually think it's the other way. I think the progressive way is to go, what do we need to do to support these different groups of people? And also, it's progressive to try and give everybody choice at the end of their life. At the moment, people are dying on trolleys in corridors. People are not dying at home because there isn't the support, the healthcare, the social care. People are dying of cancer because the waiting lists and the treatments are being denied them. The suffering that exists that people are apathetic about, that's what probably angers me the most, is that, the absolute travesty of lack of funding of end-of-life care in the UK, in most countries. Nobody puts the money into that campaign the way they do this ubiquitous right to die. And there's bullshit right to die. It's meaningless. It's not a right to die. It's an inevitability to die. So, why is there not that passion? Because I think everybody gets on there and goes, absolutely, it's a good thing. Of course it's a good thing. And I'd want it. Everybody personalises it, or the majority, and go, if that was me, I would want that. And I think what they're not realising is they can have a lot more choice now at the end of their lives, and they could have even more with better funding and priorities than legalising assisted suicide. People just don't know, and they don't want to engage.
It's really depressing. And I think...
I like how you got me on for comedy, by the way.
No, I know.
I'm really glad that when you introduced me...
We're going to go down.
You didn't say you used to do comedy. Yeah. Yeah, didn't she used to do comedy? She's really serious. God, yeah.
Well, I just thought, if I could drag us even further into the depths. So
Great.
I was really struck that it was part of the progressive menu, because when I looked at the history of the movement in the eugenics of the 1930s, I was really surprised to see that as late as the 1980s, like the General Secretary of what is now Dignity and Dying was sent to prison for commissioning the killing of women, mostly women, the majority of whom seem not to have terminal illness, but seemed in fact to have things like multiple sclerosis, a mental health issue, agoraphobia. But I was really struck that seemed to be in memory hold. And I don't know why. Like, why would that not be something we would take into account when we're considering whether it's a good idea to pass a law around this? And I don't know. I mean, what's your sense of? Because this isn't like this, as you say, this is not a new debate, and we're all coming to this very fresh and going, gosh, it's like people are feeling a burden, and what about the vulnerable? And but you like this stuff has been going on for such a long time. There's so much history. Why do you think this has ended up being progressive? Is it because it is genuinely progressive, or because actually is it just that it was maybe a very effective targeted campaign?
You said before about cultural change, Chelsea, right? And I remember when I was making the World Service documentary back in 2012, and I went and met Barbara Coombs-Lee, who runs, I don't know if is she still at the helm of Compassion and Choices? I don't know. But she used to be at the helm of the Death with Dignity advocacy group. So the same as Dignity in Dying over here. She was that over there. But they had, they had won a campaign for it in Oregon, and they got it. So I went and met her, and she said to me that it's culture. This is about creating the correct cultural environment. It's about changing the culture. And that takes 10 to 20 years, and then you can get the law through. So that's what they did. And they had a referendum. Because by that point, and like if really, I think any country that has a referendum on it, that's, I shouldn't be saying this so publicly. Referendums are the way to get it passed, because the majority of people go, I think it's a good thing. Yes, well done. Well done, Les. And I guess it goes along with, gay rights, women's, any kind of basically individual rights, autonomy. Bodily autonomy has become such a fraught and a complicated area in the last, particularly 10 years, I would say, that it has now joined that area as seen as progressive and kind of inevitable. Like, of course, it's got to go there. What I would say is I have a pet peeve, of hearing it's very good spin on the other side of like, 31 jurisdictions and, 350 to 400 million people have access to assisted suicide. We're falling behind. Okay, I'm going to be nerdy, but 14 countries, that's it. And there's 190 odd countries in the world. 400 million people isn't even 5% of the world's population. So it's tiny. Let's turn that spin around and go, so the majority of people don't have access to assisted suicide. They are struggling to get their basic needs met. And that even includes wealthy countries like the UK. And until that changes, this cannot be a debate. But, it is, and it's happening, and it's happening very much before us at the moment.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you noted about cultural change. And I know that Nikki DaCosta, who we had on the podcast earlier, has done a little bit of work uncovering some of the work that was even done on the Mental Capacity Act, almost a decade ago, to prepare it for this moment by some of the campaign organizations, which is remarkable. This has been a long game. I want to ask you, Fiona, I can see you have a look on your face that makes me think you have a question right at this moment.
I do.
So
I'll do this in the edit to make it seem seamless. But actually, I can't get over this thing I found on the internet. So it's a really old newspaper cutting from 2001 when we were all a wee bit more fresh-faced. But so this is actually a small quote from Deborah Arnett, who used to lead what is now Dignity in Dying, was then the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. But this is when the euthanasia was formally lawful in the Netherlands because they'd had a big vote from the public, I think. But she said, a psychological barrier has been broken with the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia. And in this newspaper article, it doesn't give you any more. That's literally the quote they got from her. I don't know if they chose it because it just sounds incredibly sinister. But I just thought, what does that mean? But I do think there's a... There's a bit of me that wonders, these campaigners are really good, and I can see that in the organisation they have in Australia. So they've really honed the way they've designed the initial law in each of the Australian states so that it passes. So it's enough to just pass legislature. And then afterwards, we see that the people who run assisted dying then view safeguards as barriers to access, to safe, equitable access. And so they start to trying to remove those safeguards. And there's something interesting in that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, safeguards are the way to get the laws through. It will safeguard it to the nth degree and you're all going to be fine. Pass the law. Safeguards are blocks to autonomy. And, you know, what is this really about? It's about autonomy. And that's part of the playbook. Set these things in motion. So we've seen since, you know, the last big push in the UK was in 2015. 2014, 2015 was a massive vote in the Commons. That was the last vote. And what I've seen happen since then, because one of the big arguments then was no disability rights organisation, no medical organisation. And so the campaign from Dignity in Dying has been to go round and work with the doctors' organisations and to get those votes brought in and to get that so that they're becoming neutral. And it's a small, of their memberships, it will be like any poll or anything like that. It's a relatively small group of people. It doesn't matter because symbolically, they're then going to be able to go, everybody's changing, even doctors are now. And we've managed to, and that's, what they're very good at because they have £2 million a year organisations and a whole load of staff and some of it funded by the National Lottery. They manage to do all of this work. I just think not dead yet in the UK. We've just had to do a crowdfunder to try and get some supplies to be able to protest when the next vote, which is probably the end of April or May at some point. That's where we're at in comparison of resources. And what I would say when people are feeling downhearted or like, where do we go? I think those of us who oppose punch above our weight. For the money that we have, for the time that we have, for the fact this is not our job. This is like a hobby. In fact, it's a very messed up hobby. And I think that keeping the floodgates, I think we've done incredibly well, certainly up to now. We have. And I still believe we will still hold it back, to be fair.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. And I couldn't agree more. The amount of funding that has gone into the campaign in favour of this bill, we saw those wild ads in Westminster and, the campaign against is been pretty much blood, sweat and tears from what I gather on the ground from the people working on this. Well, speaking of your hobbies, Liz, you managed to combine your work as an actress and in film and media with your hobby, which of course is talking about death, and filmed an excellent documentary of which I am wearing the swag as you are on your shoulder, Better Off Dead, which was on BBC, and really the only piece of media I've seen that has prompted conversation, even in my family, with people that are, really in favor of the bill. And we'd had, maybe some disagreements, but really made them step back and pause. And then I also think you are the only woman I know who can make assisted death funny in moments, especially this particular topic. So it's an excellent documentary. And I wondered what it was like to interview some of the doctors. I know you went to Canada, you interviewed a fairly either prolific or infamous doctor, depending on how you think of it, Dr. Alan Weeb. What was that like? I mean, I'm just thinking of you as an activist personally, as a disabled woman, and then also as a filmmaker in that moment. What was going on inside of you?
Well, also, I'm listening to you, Chelsea, and thank you for those lovely things. I'm just going to try and put a light on because I'm aware it's getting darker and darker. Able to see me, and I do like light because I like being on stage. And I'm an actor. That's slightly better.
This is how my life has felt over the last few months.
I was like, oh shit, what do I do? I'm getting darker and darker. You're being very.
I feel like it's artistic. You're metaphorically representing the stage of my
subject.
Yes, exactly.
It's a really good question. I don't think I fully know the answer, but I think I probably nearly had a nervous breakdown making it. I certainly can't. I'm weirdly a bit more backseat at the moment. That's also partly because I'm just waiting for the next vote. I'm working out where I can be the most effective because who I am has changed since I started campaigning. So I started being a visible spokesperson on this as early as 2008. And that's because I used to do a BBC podcast called Ouch, all about disability stuff, right? Very irreverent. But what it meant is when there was a big case that was around a disabled person that ended up going to Dignitas, they needed a spokesperson. I had given my views, but I had a tiny bit of profile, right? But I did not have the profile that I now have. And what I found at the vote in November was I found myself, I'm not religious, but I'm going to use a religious metaphor. I was like the Holy Trinity, right? So because I'm a nerd about this stuff, as we've acknowledged, so I know the stuff. So I wanted to be inside on the day, listening to the speeches and WhatsApping certain groups to encourage them to say other things. I have a profile, and there are so few people who speak out publicly with a profile on this subject that was very, very important at the time of votes. Always is important. But I'm also, first and foremost, really an activist. So organising protests, being on the picket line, being outside cold, holding a placard and keeping morale up, that's it too. And I really struggled at the end of November because it was the first time I really realised I'm all three of them, but I can't do them all. So now as we get to the next vote, I think that the most important thing for me to be is the visible face of it. I've done it in the documentary. I'm known, I think relatively respected. And I think, I was really frightened of making the documentary because if you oppose assisted suicide, it can be a nasty place out there. There's people are like, well, you're so lacking in compassion. How can you say no to me? I had some of the major campaigners message me during November and were like, say these things to my face then. Do you want me to suffer? Do you want me to die in pain? You obviously do. And I think I'm really well behaved and I don't come back and go, but what about all the other people? I don't want you to die in pain, and I don't want other people. Don't want them to be abused. I don't want them to feel they've got no choice. So where do we go with this? So this topic, in terms of your question, every time I interview someone or every time I do something on this, I feel like I'm essentially pleading for my life and for my community's life and for a whole bunch of us to protect us. And depending on the day, that's exhausting. It's not depending on the day, it's always exhausting. And it shouldn't be. I shouldn't have to kind of be going, look, this group of people, because they're like that, because they're different to you, should not have to basically go, we don't want that. We want same access to suicide prevention as the next person. But I know that if I went to a doctor and said that things were that tough, and I could convince them that I qualified, I know it wouldn't take much to be talked out of it. It's silly things like years ago, and I just know this to be absolutely true. This is a silly kind of anecdote, but it shows me I'm right. My soulmate died when I was in my late 20s. Absolute devastated, another disabled woman, very unexpected. And I was grief-stricken for a long, long time, really struggled. And I went to my GP because it had become too much. And I said, I'm really struggling. My friend died, a number of months ago. And my GP had known me for, 2-3 years, said, I'm really surprised, Liz, because I thought you'd come to terms with being disabled. And what I'm trying to tell you about that is it was a very clear cut of me being a disabled woman. Yes, I always am. But I was experiencing grief, deep grief. But she had to make everything about how awful it must be to be me and assume that I'm having trouble with that. That's her. That was her projection and her sense. So I know that the doctors that I interviewed for the documentary and beyond know that, of course, they go into these interviews themselves, these consultations, with such biases, with such absolutely bias towards some groups of people. And I can't see, therefore, how we can protect, how that law can be safe. So absolutely, I go and interview Ellen Weeb, prolific euthanasia if that's a phrase, euthanasia. And, I think we said that there was over 400 people she'd killed. It's way, even then it was way more, but we were being BBC safe by saying that. And she's incidentally, there have been injunctions out against her in the last 3 months because she has approved people who actually should not be approved, particularly with mental health conditions, particularly younger women. Funny that. She just basically believes it's autonomous. I mean, it really is. She said to me, there may be somebody, Liz, exactly like you, who wants assisted suicide. And she said, who am I to say no to them? And because I was sort of saying, presumably I would qualify. I know I would qualify in the Canadian law. I'd qualify in most countries' laws. It's only really the few states, the 10, 11 states in the US where it's legal, Australia and New Zealand where it's not about disability exactly, I think. So everywhere else it's about me. And that feels frightening. If times were tough, if my care package was pulled, if I'm experiencing in my real life at the moment changes, I'm aging. I'm an aging disabled person. And you start layering those things, you start layering menopause on top of your, medical conditions and aging. It's a whole world of pain. And I know other people are. So, there could be a time when my whole experience changes and it's much tougher. And I want the protection of the law. I want the protection of the medical profession. And to be honest, I want the protection of other people. So not assume that the thing that I must want would be death. To be in a room with somebody like Ellen Weeb was just more, I was just curious. I was curious, I made jokes about, it's a bit, I'm not going to sign anything or eat with you. I've been to 3 or 4 death clinics now because of the different documentaries and films that I made. And they are frightening places for somebody who opposes. And they seem like the worst place to want to die. But what I would say is, I think if you do want that right, and you do want to die through an assisted suicide, then you probably don't care what that sofa looks like. And you probably don't care that the room where it happens looks like a kind of student digs. I mean, it really is in the eye of the beholder. And I think people that want it, and they don't care. And we're seeing that in the committee, under the guise of compassion, they are determined to get this bill through, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very particular mentality.
Yeah. And even, it's exactly as you described. It's even if you have someone has a terminal diagnosis, we shouldn't just assume that any wish to die is valid. And that's the problem I can see in the committee, is that they are resistant to the idea of doing psychosocial counselling, but basically they are resistant to the idea that people should be challenged on their suicidality. If tick the box, you meet the requirement, then you're in. It's choice and autonomy, and doctors should not have the state meddling in that. And it's really worrying.
It's really worrying. It's a really good point you make, and a good reminder. And, and I've been tweeting about it. So even if this law is not explicitly about me at the moment, okay, I'm still concerned for terminally ill people. Absolutely. This is not like disability and disabled people versus terminally ill people and the associated rights. In the same way that not all disabled people agree with me, absolutely, not all terminally ill people want this. But we seem to be sold this idea that in this sort of gang, this group, terminally ill people want at least the option of that. And I think some terminally ill people, many of them, are really afraid of having that as an option. And now that we know at the moment, doctors can bring it in, doctors can bring it up to someone. I got ill when I was 7. I'm coming up to 53. So I've spent like 45 years of my life heavily in the medical profession. And I know, as assertive as I am, and as very clear as I am about what I want, I know the power of a doctor saying to you, this is the best thing for you, or even just bringing it up. So you can have that, and that. You can have assisted suicide. You can have withdrawal of treatment. You can have palliative care, just to say, We don't have 24-hour palliative care in our area. We don't have a hospice. And, there are some issues there. There's a waiting list of a month. I mean, that's actually the reality, because there's a blank check for assisted suicide, but there's not a blank check to save palliative care. So if you're offering services, the one that you can guarantee you can meet and that your doctors are almost obliged to meet the guidelines, it's assisted suicide. So not only do they bring it up, but financially they can afford to give it to you when any of those options are not guaranteed the funding.
Yeah. I almost think the mindset you've spoken about is there's two things kind of hitting up against one another and colliding. There's a very shallow conception of autonomy, of if a person says it, that must be all and end all their expression of autonomy and their free will, with very little, I always allude to the example of when a young person who's been self-harming comes to a psychiatric hospital, no one thinks it's a good idea to put them in a room by themselves with sharp objects so that they can express their autonomy, right? Because we understand that the autonomy has limits, and there's it must be balanced with other ethical principles. I think also you've spoken to almost a failure of imagination on the part of some proponents who may not understand the immense vulnerability and I call it vulnerability because I know in my despairing moments, that's my felt experience, as being very vulnerable, and someone in a position of power saying, we've done all we can, your prognosis is bleak. And even though you and I are coming from slightly different perspectives, I think we know that experience of just how powerful it is. There's many people waking up. You've been so generous with your time, and I feel like, this Fiona and I have come together because we're particularly interested in the disproportionate impact this has on women. So we'd be remiss not to ask you, particularly this intersection of, being a woman and being disabled. I know that women are 2 to 3 times at greater risk of domestic abuse. So if this bill is passed, I mean, do you have any concerns about that particular intersection? And I don't know, Fiona, do you want to add anything there? Because this is really your area. I want to make sure we
just say that
it.
No one's thought about any of this. I mean, no one in Parliament has thought about this enough.
What should MPs know? Yeah, what should MPs know about that particular intersection around domestic abuse and being disabled, care responsibilities?
I'm smiling because I'm going, all they're going to go is, it's not about disability. At the moment, their way. So I think the disability argument against assisted suicide has been so powerful, and our existence in the debate has kept it at bay for so long. And doctors, I think doctors and disabled people, disabled activists, is what has kept it at bay. They've worked on doctors becoming more neutral. That's problematic. In terms of disability, they're absolutely adamant. This is not about us, therefore, in an attempt to shut you up. So what I'd say, if I was on the other side, I'd go, absolutely, of course we hear that. No, of course we don't want that. That's dreadful, awful. But it's not about them, so don't worry. I mean, that's the bullshit response, really. I think, I know you've done incredible work on this, Fiona, is like the idea of mercy killings. I mean, this is all linked up, but what's been allowed over the years, husbands particularly killing disabled women, ill women, frail women, older women, members of their family, and it's been passed off as a compassionate act, as a mercy killing, as understandable. I used to do a talk about this subject, approached it very differently, but it talked about, cases like case after case like that, where we just see the judge go, it's okay, we get what you were going through. Yeah. And so what would MPs say? Anything that obstructs the white, worried, well-off desire for this thing that we're going to call, as they're calling assisted dying and calling assisted suicide, anything that gets in the way, they will belittle it, they will decry it as a red herring, as irrelevant, and say that it's not part of this debate and it's not a threat. It's nothing to worry about. I'm not a big fan of the word, but my experience is that the other campaign is just gaslighting at its very best. That's what it is. They refuse to hear all of the issues because they don't want to. It's like the campaigning equivalent of going la 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 la. That's how dignity in dying work. That's how the humanists work. That's how my death, my decision work. They're all as bad as each other.
We make that the clip.
But they do. I mean, that's it, isn't it? It's yes. I mean, it's on a par with kind of toddler Trump behaviour, is what it is. It's that refusing to engage, but under the guise of, you know, it's so dangerous when things are under the guise of compassion, as we know.
And it's very good strategy, though. I mean, it's very good strategy because they know that if they ignore you, what's going to happen? You've not got money, not got big funding. What are you going to do? You can write to your MP, fine, go for it. But, you know, they're, you know, very respectable, often very well funded, at the centre of Westminster politics. They don't have to engage with your arguments. And I think that's it's a very successful tactic.
You know, my sense of what's going to happen, and so I tell you it in order to be aware of it, is it doesn't really matter what's happening in committee. I think that's irrelevant because what I know is happening at the end of every day. Kim Leadbeater gives out a little, this is what's happened today. And almost always she talks about somebody who has been present in the chamber, in the room, who's part of the campaign who wants the right to die. Usually part of dignity in dying. And so she brings it back to that. And that's, of course, what it's going to be. Is it's going to be, look, you can argue this, you can say that, you can do whatever, but this is the law as it is not tenable and something has to change. And that's wrong. She's wrong, but enough people are believing that. And that's what it will come down to. It won't come down to the really thought through, incredible arguments from the lawyers and the doctors and the people that understand coercion and coercive control, psychiatrists, activists, all those groups. Forget that. What about those 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people who want this option for them? And those people who had relatives who had bad deaths. None of those I'm denying are real. Absolutely not. And none of those am I saying are acceptable. But isn't there a solution that makes sure that everybody gets their needs met? And I believe there is. And I believe that's about supporting end-of-life care and looking at the current law. I think if the police dealt better with assisted suicides, I think we could keep the protections that currently exist, and I think we could make the law work better. But nobody looks at that. They look at changing the law rather than looking at the existing law and strengthening that. That's where I put my focus.
Well, this is it. Max Hill, former director of the CPS, said he had 27 cases in his 5 years in that role. And so for the sake of those 27 cases, we introduced something that will potentially kill 5,000 or 10,000 people a year. More.
And not one of those cases has been about somebody going to Dignitas. As I understand it, not one. There's not been. So the line that we hear about, I'm worried about my family, I'm scared about that, clarify that. Make that clearer in law. Because I can absolutely imagine that's horrible, the stress that families go through. However, it's fairly clear in guidelines. And I think if that was implemented in police action as well, because absolutely the CPS, they've, it's 100 and odd cases over 20 odd years, and not one person's been prosecuted for supporting somebody to go to Dignitas. Do we hear about that? It's convenient not to hear about that. But that's the fear that's leading people to, as you say, change the law in a way that will impact. And what's horrified me this week, and I'm sure it has you too, is, and particularly the brilliant Catherine Sleeman asks again and again, how many lives are we prepared to see sacrificed for this law? How many? Because there will be collateral damage. And we're increasingly hearing, I think those who are for the bill going, we acknowledge that nothing's risk-free. And I find that a change, and I find that chilling.
Yeah. I mean, that was Prue Leith, who, my mum will be turning in her grave because she was such a fan of her cookbooks. I love Prue, but she said, I mean, just this week, she said, I will actually read it out because it's quite useful. Of course, no law can prevent deliberate criminality, and I accept that there might be the occasional use of assisted dying when the patient's not genuinely wanted it. But even should this be so, the many thousands of people who will currently suffer a horrific death and who will, under a new law, be granted a peaceful one, will hugely outnumber such criminal cases. So,
always interesting how many that figure goes up and up. It's now thousands. Because, not that long ago, very few people will use this law.
yes.
Very few people will want it. Now it's thousands. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Liz, I want to thank you so much for your time. You've been incredibly generous with your time, not just with us with this hour, but with this entire movement. And I know you have taken a moment to stand back now, but I'm just incredibly grateful that you're in this work and that you're bringing this to light, and that you've forged the path for people like Fiona and I to get educated in the words of Diane Coleman a whole lot faster. So thank you.
Well, thank you for taking on the baton as well.
Hi, it's Fiona. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to The Other Half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. So grateful for this, and so grateful for you listening, though. Thank you.